Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for giving a part of your Sunday for us to enjoy what you have to share today. This is Stanley British Primary School for Unit 5. I'm still Mark McCall, your facilitator and timer, just as yesterday. And if you're okay with it, we'll stick with the timing signals I gave you, that green background for 1 minute left, and that yellow background when your time is up at 4 minutes and 8 minutes. And that's really all I have. I'm going to enjoy what you have to say. I'm going to turn it over to the judges.
Great. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. It's good to see you again. I hope you had a nice evening and got a good night's sleep so that you're ready to shine again today. I'm Candida Steele still, and retired judge from government contracts. And Rebecca?
Congratulations again, and thank you for being here. We're excited to hear from you. I'm Rebecca Tinder, a retired attorney from Charleston, West Virginia, and the West Virginia We the People coordinator.
Lindsay?
And I'm Lindsay Draper, currently Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the Institute for Wellbeing in Law.
Great. And can you tell us who you all are?
Hello, my name is Donovan Aguilar, and I'm in 8th grade.
Hi, I'm Samantha Ingleby, and I'm also in 8th grade.
Hi, I'm Lila Hutchins. I'm in 7th grade, and these are our coaches, Mike Wazelinski and Susan Cleveland.
Welcome again. And we're going to do the second question today, funny surprise, and I'll read it for the record. Political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that, quote, the right of peaceable assembly, unquote, is part of the, quote, constitutional substitute for revolution, end quote. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What is the history of freedom of assembly in America? What historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in law or policies? And what limits, if any, should be placed on the right to freedom of assembly? You may begin.
When the government ignores the pleas of assembly by the citizens, they have no choice but to revolt. Abigail Adams once spoke for women, "We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." As a panel, we agree with Lincoln because some social movements have made a successful change in our government. However, others may believe the anti-slavery movements leading up to the Civil War were so powerful that only a revolution could resolve such destructive conflicts.
The right to assembly is not the only apparatus that has prevented this country from revolution in 150 years. It is a matter of the government listening to the people and their ideas. When the government listens to the people's cries for change and has the capability to make difficult decisions, revolution can be prevented.
Leading up to the Civil War, the debate of whether to allow slavery or not was extremely heated. Therefore, the Assembly and the government could not prevent the war without solving the issue. Prior to the Revolutionary War, the English government ignored the colonists' requests. If the people are not heard by the government, they are destined to create a new government that protects the people. The right to assembly and petition was recognized in England hundreds of years before the Revolutionary War. The American colonists petitioned the English government because getting the power to present your ideas to the government in person was very difficult. Because the colonists needed to get their opinions to the government, they sent letters.
However, the colonists grew outraged when they thought the parliament was ignoring their letters. This is one of the many reasons why there was a revolution. Alone, the right to assemble could not overthrow the English government. If the king and parliament ignored and deprived the citizens of their rights, only a revolution could make the change the colonists wanted. We progressed forward, specifically with women and the passing of the 19th Amendment after World War I, without a revolution. Suffragists witnessed the culmination of their assemblies and protests in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified.
In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights fight was protected through the First Amendment, specifically the right to assembly. The Million Man March, the March on Selma, the Freedom Riders, lunch counter sit-ins, the Children's March, and the Montgomery bus boycotts were all examples of Americans exercising their rights to peacefully assemble and protest, yielding change and growth in our country. As a result of these protests, the United States was desegregated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Finally, as we look at the ability to protest and assemble today, we can see progress being made in regard to gender rights. Protests to recognize gay rights and same-sex marriage have forwarded progress in these areas. As we have shared in our abbreviated timeline of assembly and protest in America, not all social movements are made to overthrow the government, and they can lead to positive change without a violent revolution.
Freedom of assembly is a powerful right that should be protected. However, limits come with this right. Just like freedom of speech, time, place, and manner should be taken into account with freedom of assembly.
Events need to occur at a time that is deemed acceptable by the general public. Place limits mean there are caps on the number of protesters who may occupy a certain space and restrictions on the size and placement of signs on public property. Manner restrictions impact the level of noise permitted at an assembly.
Limits on freedom of assembly must hold up to a three-pronged test outlined by the Supreme Court in Ward v. Rock Against Racism, 1989. The regulation on the event must be content neutral. The restrictions serve a specific governmental interest and must leave open alternative channels for communicating the speaker's message. Police Department of Chicago v. Mosley, 1972, provides an example of regulation that failed the content neutrality requirement. Picketing was prohibited within 150 feet of any school. However, it was allowed if the school was involved in a labor dispute.
Writing for the court, Justice Marshall observed the ordinance described impermissible picketing not in terms of time, place, and manner, but in terms of subject matter. The regulation thus slips from the neutrality of time, place, and circumstance into a concern about content. This is never permitted. We are now open for questions.
Great, thank you very much. I was very interested in your comment in your opening statement that if the government listens, can you think of other examples where the government hasn't listened?
In our opening, we mentioned that during when the United States was part of the United Kingdom, we tried to write letters to the Parliament to get our opinion across. When they did not accept our letters, we had to find a different way of speaking, in which we did through revolution and
Can
getting
you
our
think
country.
of other examples that you haven't mentioned in your opening statement that cover the same?
An example of that would be when they did not accept women having the right to vote. Obviously, they now have the right to vote, but in the beginning, it was very frowned upon and was not taken into account by the government.
Okay.
In DeYoung versus Oregon, the Supreme Court held that freedom of assembly was as important as freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I believe that I agree with that. This is because one person alone could not get their opinion across. You need multiple people. One person alone could, but it's easier and it's more easy to get your opinion across if you have an assembly of people that can get their information to the government. If you have only one person, it's hard to get just one person's voice when you have, like, let's say 100 people in an assembly to get their voice across.
But couldn't they do that by just calling their congressional leaders? Why do we have to assemble? Why is that important?
Assembly creates a bigger impact and draws more attention to what is happening. Speech alone can give a very strong example, but if you have multiple people in the same area proving a message, it can lead to more change in a country.
So if you decide that you want to have an assembly, what are the responsibilities that you as the organizer have? What do you have to, what are your responsibilities?
I believe some of your responsibilities would be to make sure that the protest is at a good time in the day, a time that is deemed acceptable by the general public, and that it doesn't get violent or out of hand.
Do you have, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay. To add on to my panel mate, I think that it is all depending on different things, and the organizer does not take full responsibility for everything that happens at an assembly, but they take responsibility for what they planned at the assembly, and what they plan should be in ordinance with what the city is okay with, and things like that.
So getting the right permit, telling folks that we plan on doing this, those kinds of following, or do I have any responsibility to establish control of who participates in my march or my protest?
I believe that you do have some responsibility. For example, in the January 6th riots, Trump had responsibility over that group of people because they were kind of an outraged group. And when he directly told them to go to the Capitol, when he told them to walk to the Capitol, I believe that he had to take responsibility for that because he was the one that incited the violence. He might have not been part of that protest doing the damage, but he was the one that told the enraged group. So he needs to take at least some, he would not need to take at least some responsibility for that. So the organizer does take some responsibility in that.
Okay, thank you.
one of the things that raises of current demonstrations and things is involvement of the police and how the police respond to them. Do you think that the protests this year have caused any changes in how the police departments respond to protests?
I believe that there has been made a lot more awareness about how the police do respond to different protests and the levels of violence at that protest. It all depends on many different things, though.
All depends on what?
She said many different things.
Thank you.
But quickly adding on to my panel mate, I believe that in the recent actions that we've had with police brutality, a lot of those policemen have been charged and have been sent to have served, I guess, some time. So I believe that since they are doing that, I believe that that kind of sets an example of that you can't use police brutality or you will still get fined for these actions. It still has a long way to go to make it totally unbiased, but I believe that since we are taking these steps, it is getting slightly better.
You talked a little bit about the court cases on time, place, and manner and content neutral regulations. Are there other court cases that have placed limits on assembly? And if so, were they justified?
I believe in a court case of Skokie v. Illinois, how they were protesting in a place that they were protesting a message that was in a place that was predominantly against that group. I believe that since that is with place where they're protesting in or where they were in a place where they was predominantly against that group, I believe that's kind of place for the time, place, and manner.
You think that was an appropriate place?
No, I believe it was an inappropriate place against time, place, and manner because it's the place in the time, place, and manner.
So you would have prevented that gathering?
Yes.
So if one of the protests that I talk about a lot would be the 2 marches that the Ku Klux Klan had in Washington, where between 20 and 30,000 Klansmen in robes marched down the street. Where would you suggest that they have that protest, if not down the streets of our nation's capital, if you're going to regulate what the appropriate place would be? I mean, do you understand my question? It sounds like, okay, go ahead. Where would you suggest they have that march?
I mean, I believe that they should be able to have that march on those streets as long as it's not hurting people. With the thing that Donovan said, I think that it was in an inappropriate place, as there were many different people who were Jewish who had survived the Holocaust and things like that. There were a lot of lingering feelings about that were uncomfortable for many people and could have potentially hurt a lot of people. I do believe that they have the right to march, and down the streets of Washington, they should have that right to march as long as they're not hurting a lot of people.
Okay, thanks.
Well, how about another protest that caused a lot of grief and excitement in this country? How about the Vietnam protests in the 60s and 70s? Do you have an opinion about whether they were successful or not?
Whether or not they are successful is not something that I could really put my finger on. But I think that they should be allowed, and the people had their right to say what they wanted to say, and they did not believe in the Vietnam War, and they thought it was unnecessary for our people to be fighting in. And whether or not that is right of them to do that is up to your interpretation. But I believe that they definitely had the right to do that.
Great, thank you very much. Great job. That was a lovely job. There were several things I appreciated about your comments. Bringing up the lack of attention might lead to, at people's protests, might lead to revolution if it doesn't work, if the government doesn't listen. That was a really nice point to talk about. Talking about police and whether or not they've been pulled back a little bit in military interests and stuff. I don't know whether you all saw that on the news yesterday, Pittsburgh has apparently put through local ordinances that the police are not allowed to use tear gas or rubber or wooden bullets in peaceful demonstrations, I guess. And also Maryland just this week withdrew the police Bill of Rights that the police departments had put through. So there are changes happening as a result of protesting, and some of it works better than others. But thank you. You did a really lovely job, and you covered a lot of territory. And you all had things to say, and I really appreciated talking to all of you. Thank you. Rebecca?
Sure, I echo my co-judge's remarks and enjoyed the beginning with the Abigail Adams quote. I thought that was a very good quote. You took us through a lot of history and wove in a couple of cases during your prepared remarks, and then pulled out the Skokie case in reference to the questions when you were applying what you've learned to the questions that were being asked, which was really good. You went all the way back to our underpinnings, letters to Parliament before we became the United States, and explained how things weren't working, so we needed to do things differently, and we came up with a new system that we're discussing now. I think your presentation was really good. You really showed you understood these concepts, and we were able to have a wonderful discussion, and we could have gone on for a long time, which is a good sign. Great job.
I apologize. I enjoyed your presentation as well. Let me just tell you, one of the things I would challenge you to do for me, and sort of remember that there are some of us who are touched a lot by certain issues, and when we hear things grouped together, we get a little concerned. The Million Man March was in the 1990s. It was not part of the civil rights era activity. So I would just share with you, be careful that when everything that is led by a huge number of African Americans doesn't mean it's part of the same thing. So I just ask you, watch that, because sometimes that touches sensitivities that I don't know that you want to touch. You did a really good job. I loved the beginning piece, and I too made note of the Abigail Adams quote, because there have been people who from the beginning of our country have talked about not having a voice in what happened. So that was a real big one with me. Glad you touched on the women's movement in the 19th Amendment, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ plus issues. I thought you did a good summary of what this question tries to address, and you went back a number of times to time, place, manner. Be sure you all get it right. So very good. It's been good listening to you again. I appreciate the work that you and your teachers have done, and wish you luck. Thanks.
Thanks, team. Thanks, Mr. Weslenke. We really appreciate your hard work, and Ms. Cleveland as well. And with that,